Hello everybody. In this video we're going to take a look at normal maps and bump maps. We'll compare normal maps and bump maps and we'll look at the advantages to using them, where normal and bump maps are useful and where they're not so useful. So to begin, I have this very simple sphere. So the first thing I'm going to do is up the resolution on it so that we have more geometry to work with. And I'm going to create a sculpt layer. I'm going to choose my sculpt tool. And what I'd like you to notice is that I am using a stamp image here. I have quite a bit of distance on it, and I've randomized some of the parameters of it, including the rotation, the scale, and the strength of it. Okay, so let's sculpt in a little bit of detail on this sphere. And for the sake of this demonstration, this should be fine. So what I'd like you to take note of here is that we've got this sculpting in it that gives us this nice textural quality to the sphere. But notice how we haven't really changed the silhouette of our model here. If we take a look at the edges around here of the mesh itself, we haven't really changed the shape of it. What I'm going to do is extract out a normal map. So remember that I did up the resolution, and we have it at quite a high level, at level 6 and over 1,500,000 faces. And what I'm going to do is go to my UVs and maps, extract texture maps, new operation, and we're going to extract out a normal map. I'm going to keep this at the defaults currently, so my target model will be my level 0 model, my lowest mesh model, which will work fine for this example. And the source, typically for the normal maps, the source, you're going to want it to be the highest resolution model. So that's what we have here, level 6. I'm going to keep most of these at the default. Maybe I'll go ahead and up the image size to 2048 by 2048 to get a better resolution, as well as adding some anti-aliasing. I will keep this at compatibility with Maya because we're going to actually be bringing this into Maya very shortly. We'll give the normal map a name. And extract it. So notice that after we created that normal map, it's actually increased the effect that we've sculpted in here, or at least the visual of it. It's increased it. It's made it look more pronounced. So what I'm going to do is go back over to my layers and switch over to my paint layer here. And you'll notice that in my paint layer, we have a normal map here. And I can turn on or off this normal map. If I turn it off, our mesh looks as it did originally. So the thing to keep in mind with these normal maps is that actually, when I'm at this very high resolution, I really don't need my normal map because I actually have these details sculpted into the mesh itself. But if I use page down and bring down the resolution of my mesh, For instance, going all the way to my level 0, where the polygon count is only 384 faces, I don't have a high resolution mesh, and there isn't really enough resolution on this mesh to show that sculpted detail that we were looking at earlier. And this is where the normal map will come in really handy. So if I turn on the normal map, you'll see that in fact it looks pretty good. Even though this detail is not actually sculpted into this lower level mesh, we still get the illusion of the detail being modeled or sculpted into it. This is, of course, very useful if we're taking this mesh into other software, such as Maya or the Unity game engine, where we really cannot be working with meshes that are 1,500,000 faces. So let's see what happens if we send our low polygon mesh here, if we send it to Maya. I'm going to select my mesh here in my object list, go to File, Send to Maya, Send Selected as New Scene. And we'll take a look at it in Maya. And here it is. Now, this is the lower polygon mesh, as you can see here. In fact, if I were to go to Display, Heads Up Display, Poly Count, you'll notice that it is only 384 faces, not a high resolution mesh. We aren't seeing the normal map applied to it right now, but that is because in Maya, 4 is wireframe. If you press 4 on your keyboard, that is. 5 is shaded, and 6 is textured. So if we press 6, we can see our normal map or any other texture map we have applied. We can then see it in our viewport. Let's take a quick look at what normal maps look like. So here we have the normal map that we just exported out. As you can see, it's simply a two-dimensional texture, an image, but it is this image that can give the illusion that there's more modeling or sculpting on a mesh than there actually is. So let's go ahead and take a look at what this looks like if we were to render it out in Maya. I'm going to change my render to Maya software, and we'll render it out. And as you can see, it appears to have the normal map applied to it, giving the illusion that there is more sculpted and modeled detail in the mesh than there actually is. Although the actual effect of it looks a bit harsh right now. So let's take a look at how we can fix that in Maya. I'm going to go ahead and keep this image here so that we can compare it to the image that I'm about to create. So what I'm going to do is go to my hypershade, select the material that's been applied to that mesh, and we'll look at its input and output connections here. And I'm going to find the node that affects the bump property. Notice that we can see it right here. This is my material with all its different properties such as color, incandescence, and so on and so on. One of the channels of my material is normal camera. That is what my bump map is applied to. You can see that it's feeding into it. This is the actual normal map that we just created in Mudbox, feeding into this bump node. And then the bump node here, the bump 2D1 node, feeds into the normal or bump property of the material. I'm going to select this node here and open up the attribute editor. And what I'd like you to take note of is this property here, bump depth, which is set to 1. One other thing I should mention is This says use as tangent space normals. We have a drop down here where we have a couple other selections. If it were a normal bump, it would be set to a normal bump map, that is, it would be set to this property. But we're going to keep it on tangent space normals because this is actually a normal map. So what I'm going to do to make that bump map look, or that normal map look a little bit better on our mesh, is bring down this property here, the bump depth. Let's try bringing it down to a smaller number, such as 0.3. And we'll go ahead and render that out and compare it to our other image. We'll keep that image. And if we look at these two examples, you can see here's what it looked like originally, and here is what it looks like now. Again, we could continue adjusting that number. If we feel like this is too harsh, we'll make the number smaller. If we need it to be more pronounced, we'll make this property of bump depth bigger, a higher value. So I spent just a couple minutes creating two lights. I have a spotlight and an ambient light in here. And I further adjusted the bump depth. I brought it down slightly more, down to a value of 0.2. Just to play around a little bit with it. And here is what I have. Go ahead and save that image. We can compare it to the other two images. And you can see how the normal map is working, giving us that added detail that looks modeled or sculpted, but is in fact just a texture trick using a normal map. Again, this is very effective when the details that you're trying to bring out in your model do not change the silhouette of the mesh itself. So the places where it becomes very apparent at times with bump maps or normal maps is these edges of the mesh right here. But because my normal map here isn't really changing, it doesn't need to change the silhouette, it works very effectively in this situation. So let's take a look at yet another example. What I'm going to do is go back to my sculpt layer here. In fact, let me go ahead and I'm going to get rid of this normal map here because we're going to be creating a new one. Go to my sculpt layer and go up to my higher resolution mesh here. We can go ahead and keep this sculpted detail here. That'll be fine for this example. Maybe I will create another layer, however, and this time what I'm going to do is use the same stamp, but to get a little bit more change in the silhouette of this model, we'll try using the imprint. I'm going to make sure that the strength of the brush is strong enough for what I'm going to do, and we'll just drag in this, drag in a couple of these perhaps. And I'll just bring that down a little. So looking at this, what you can see is that in fact we are changing the outline or the silhouette of the mesh this time. Notice that around the edges here we come to this area and you can see that the silhouette of the mesh itself has changed. And this is what a normal map cannot reproduce. This is where we actually need to keep some of the modeling sculpting on this if we want these details on our mesh in Maya or in the Unity game engine. So we'll go ahead and do just like we did with the previous example, and we'll export out a normal map. Before I do that, let's just go page down so you can see what the lower resolution meshes look like. As you can see, each time I click on the page down, I go down in a level on my mesh. My mesh becomes a lower resolution mesh. We still maintain a pretty good silhouette here. At level 3, still a pretty good silhouette. As we get to level 2, where we only have 6,144 faces, you can see that the silhouette starts to break up a bit. And then finally, when we go all the way to level 0, at only 384 polygons, there just isn't enough resolution to maintain that silhouette. Let's go ahead and go back up, and we'll go ahead and export out our normal map. So once again, I'll go to UVs and maps, export texture maps. We'll do a new operation here. It'll once again be a normal map. I'm going to once again keep the default. So we're going to have our target mesh be the level 0, our very low polygon sphere, and we'll have the source be the level 6. Just like the previous example, we'll make sure it's 2048 by 2048. Turning on the anti-aliasing, compatibility with Maya, and we'll go ahead and give this a name. My texture map, that is, the map that's going to get exported, and we'll go ahead and extract it. So remember that initially when you create your normal map, it'll actually apply it to your mesh as a texture. So not only on this level, on our high level, do we have the actual details sculpted in, but they're being enhanced through this normal map on its as part of its texture layers. So we can turn that off. We don't need it on this level because this level actually has all the detail sculpted in, but turning it back on and doing our page down, we can go to some of the lower levels. In fact, we'll go all the way to level 0. And what you'll see is that the details look pretty good in these areas, but in these areas where we would like to maintain that silhouette, it really isn't coming across. And I'm not going to export this out to Maya because we can see how it's going to look here in Mudbox. I'm going to go ahead and delete this normal map here and do my page up to get to my higher level. We'll do another page down and we'll pick a level that will be a nice compromise where we'll still be able to maintain something of the silhouette here at the edges, but where it's not too high polygon. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and try level 3 at 24,576 polygons. So level 3 will be our target mesh. Let's go ahead and go through the process of creating another normal map. UVs and maps. We'll do another operation, normal map. This time, instead of level 0 being our target, we'll go to the drop down and we'll pick our level 3. Make some of those same settings that we did with the earlier examples. And extract it. And here it is. And if we go down to our level 3, you can see that we get a nice compromise of maintaining our silhouette here while still getting this nice detail through the normal map. Let's go ahead and try exporting this one out to Mudbox. I'm going to select my level 3, go to File, Send to Maya, Send selected as new scene, and let's see, send base mesh instead. No, send mesh at current level because that's the level that we're currently at. So we'll go ahead and send that over. And take a look at it in Maya. So here it is in Maya. We're not currently looking at it with the textures, but you can see that we still have the geometry in there that gives us the change in the silhouette. And by pressing 6, we can take a look at it with the normal map applied to it as well. Now, once again, I'm going to go to my Hypershades, select the material, click on its input and output connections, select its bump 2D node, and bring down the bump depth value here. And we can try rendering that out. And as you can see, we maintain the change in the silhouette. And we get the detail, the sculpted detail, without the added cost of having a mesh that is excessively high in its polygon count. And if we wish to take a look at its normal map, the normal map that is currently applied to the mesh, here it is. So before wrapping up this video, I'd like to show you one more thing, and that is how we can create simple bump maps in Mudbox, and maybe talk a little bit about why we might do that. I'm not going to do any sculpting on this mesh. We're going to go ahead and keep, I've started a new scene, just so you know. And this current sphere is just the default one, so it basically has 2 levels right now of faces at 384 and 1536. So it's a very low resolution mesh. We're not going to do any sculpting on it. But what I am going to do is create a new material for it, which is maybe something I should have done with the earlier examples, but I did not. So we'll go ahead and assign a new texture, a Mudbox material to it. And I'll go to my layers, paint layer, and we'll go ahead and add a new layer to it. Now, we've looked in previous weeks, we've looked at the diffuse, specular, gloss, incandescence, opacity. What I'm going to apply is a bump map. And we'll say OK. So now we can paint a bump map on this mesh. So I'll go to my paint tools here. And we can try projection. Let's try projection here. And choose a stencil. Let's try this one. Okay. So what I'd like you to notice here is that it looks like I've just sculpted a lot of detail on this mesh. Now, if we rotate it, once again, you're going to see that there is no change in its actual silhouette, indicating that there is no sculpting on this. And remember, this is actually a very low resolution mesh right now. If I were to hide the bump map, you'll see that we don't see that effect. If I move my light around, you'll see that the light works appropriately on this bump map, giving the illusion that the detail is actually modeled or sculpted into it. But if I right-click on the bump map here and select Solo as diffused, you'll see what the actual map looks like. And it's simply a black and white image with the white areas or lighter areas appearing to be coming out, and then the darker areas appearing to be depressed into the mesh. Let's go ahead and unsolo that. So what I'd like to say about this technique or this method is that it's very cheap and yet very economical, yet it may give you much of the effects that you're looking for. Let's go ahead and try sending this to into Maya and see how it looks. So we'll go ahead and just send as a new scene. I'm going to send the mesh at the current level. And we'll take a look at it here. Once again, you can see it's a very simple sphere with nothing really happening on it. But if I press 6 on my keyboard, you'll see that we'll have our textures visible now. And we in fact have our bump map. Now, very similar to the normal maps that we were looking at earlier, a bump map is also just a 2D texture. 2D texture that is applied to give the illusion of there being more geometry than there actually is. I'm going to select my material. Once again, I'll select my bump 2D node and maybe just bring down its values a little. And as you can see, it looks pretty good. So if you want to see what the bump map looks like, here it is here. As you can see, it is simply a black and white and gray value image, but it can be also very effective for giving the illusion of there being more modeling or sculpting on your meshes than there actually is. So in conclusion, what I hope that you got from this, or at least one of the takeaways that I hope that you got from this video, is that you can oftentimes get away with more economical solutions than modeling and sculpting. In this case, remember that we're looking at nothing more than a bump map here. In fact, let's go ahead and contrast that with actually sculpting in some similar details onto this mesh. So I'm going to switch over to my sculpt. We'll select that same, the same stencil here, and we'll try sculpting in some of this detail here. And what you'll notice is it doesn't work. Why? Because we don't have enough resolution on the mesh. So what we need to do is up the resolution. Looks good here, but this is simply a bump map. Here it doesn't look good because we don't have enough resolution to actually sculpt the detail in. I'll go ahead and do a couple page ups, Shift D's here to up the resolution to 1.5 million or so, and we'll go ahead and sculpt in some of that detail. We can compare it with our bump map from earlier. The bump map looks pretty good. The sculpting also looks good, looks very similar, but requires higher resolution. If we do our page down, going back down to our mesh of 384 faces, you can see that we lose all our modeling, all our sculpting, while the bump map still looks good. Anyway, I hope that this video was useful for you, and thank you for watching.